Welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was James Vincent McMorrow with Red Dust. And on this week's show, I want to do a recap of some recent science news. And actually, it's quite timely that I should do this, I think, because I've been gone for so long now that you guys are probably really far behind and you want to know what's happening in the world of science. So hopefully I can talk about the stuff that's been most interesting over the last few weeks. And the reason that I selected James Vincent McMorrow's song to start us off is that I want to think about some dust that has been making the news lately, and that is interplanetary dust in particular. And this has been in the news because researchers have found quite a good amount of evidence that interplanetary dust particles, or IDP for short, could carry life across the solar system, and might in the past have actually done this, which would be quite an exciting finding because it may mean that this is one of the ways that Earth could have gained the life that we now see on it. So interplanetary dust, I've kind of talked about this a little bit in the past when I talked about some kind of astronomically oriented themes. But just to remind you, this is dust that comes from things like comets and asteroids and even the debris that's been left over from the birth of the solar system billions of years ago. And there's a lot of it out there, and it continually rains down on the Earth and on various other bodies in the solar system. And before that happens, while it's still up there out in space, kind of floating around and moving around, it is impacted by solar winds. And you might remember from previous discussions that solar winds can actually reach really long distances. So even though they are emanating from our sun in the center of the solar system, they can actually go quite far out into our little universe here in the Milky Way and have lots of impacts on things that are actually quite distant. And one of the reasons that this is the case is that there are hydrogen ions contained within those solar winds. And when these hydrogen ions interact with the interplanetary dust, they can disrupt the atoms in the silicate mineral crystals that are often a part of these dust particles. And they also can leave behind oxygen, and the oxygen can react with hydrogen and then create other molecules. And if you know a little bit about basic chemistry and basic biology, you already know that hydrogen and oxygen, when they interact with each other, they can form the molecule H2O, or water. And of course, water is probably the key thing for creating life. If we don't have water molecules, we can't create new life. So it's quite exciting to think that these particles that are out there in space might interact with the solar winds in just the right way to create water and then transport it to new locations. And the reason that scientists were finally able to determine this is that there have been some recent advances in microscopy. And so they have these really powerful, very nice transmission electron microscopes that allow them to detect the water where it's tucked away in the outer edges of these particles. Now, as you imagine, the particles are kind of rough. Basically, if you think about a little chunk of rock that you might find on a beach or at the base of a cliff, the particles are like that. They're just really, really small. But they have those sorts of kind of variations on the surface. They have sharp bits, they have little hollows, they have softer bits. And so, of course, some of those are going to have little areas where you can kind of tuck these molecules in, where the water molecules might kind of be able to hide as they're transported. So these are the features that these microscopes were able to look at finally. And of course, that is going to require an extremely powerful microscope to be able to find a feature that small. And all of these particles that they were investigating were things that had been brought back from space on previous missions. But they were also able to kind of do some laboratory experiments where they took minerals and they irradiated them experimentally in a laboratory setting, thus confirming by kind of replicating these conditions that would have been found out in space. They replicated them here on Earth, and they found that indeed you can have this same sort of thing happening right here. So when you've got these hydrogen ions interacting with the oxygen, they can produce water. And the research helps explain some observations that have actually been made and theories that have been proposed since the Apollo era back in the 60s. And that's because these astronauts brought back lunar samples. And these revealed that the surface layer of the dust on the moon is different from the layers that are underneath it. And this has been theorized to result from solar wind activity. So that dust that was most recently out there in space was interacting with the solar winds before settling on the moon and on other surfaces elsewhere in a slightly different form than this dust that had settled before it. And so people kind of theorized that this is why this was happening. It was all a result of the solar winds, but it wasn't until now that they were actually able to do this. And one of the reasons it was so hard in the past was that the little rims that they were looking for, these little kind of overhangs under which the water could be trapped, are incredibly, incredibly small. And so back in the 60s, they did not have the stuff that was needed in order to blow these images up and really look at them. And it's not until now that we really have that capability. And of course, as I said, this has implications potentially for life on Earth, but also potentially for life or possible life on other planets as well. And what's really exciting is that dust from primitive asteroids and also comets is known to carry organic carbon. And organic carbon is carbon that forms these compounds that are able to create life and are incorporated into living materials. And so this kind of compound is the sort of thing you would want to be looking for in sediments and in objects that are brought back from planets or other objects elsewhere in the solar system as evidence of potential life or a habitat where life might be created. So it's quite exciting to find that you can have these organic compounds on this dust, but also you can have the water that's created when the dust interacts with the solar winds. So that means that basically these little particles could be acting as vessels, to use the words of one of the researchers, little reaction vessels that are seeding habitats with components of life, both the compounds and the water needed to mix together and create life. Now, of course, we don't know whether this is actually responsible for the appearance of life on Earth or potentially even other planets as well. And we also don't know what the total quantity of delivered materials has been over time or could be over time. So the researchers made certain to say they don't think that this is what's created the oceans, for example. That would be a massive amount of water, and that would take way more particles than we're talking about here. But it could be quite a significant impact, nevertheless, if you do have just the right amount of stuff being delivered to just the right space at just the right time. So it would only have to be a few particles that would deliver the stuff that's needed to kick life off, even if it's not, delivering all of life or delivering all of those things that you find in a given habitat. And so one of the next steps is actually to try to estimate the abundance, the total amount of particles, the total amount of things that they might have deposited over time, and to add all that up and kind of think what is the long-term impact of all this stuff and its activity. And also the researchers want to do kind of a survey and figure out the full range of both the organic and the inorganic compounds that tend to be present on the dust particles. And that would allow them to get a better idea of what exactly would be the implications of these particles. What are they delivering, and how might this have impacted the habitats where the particles are landing? Now, the next news item that I would like to address is also one that has to do with some astronomy. And this is something that just came out over the past weekend, I think, and it is related to a special birthday issue of Science journal that has come out in order to kind of recognize the Mars rovers, because the Mars rovers are now celebrating their 10-year anniversary. And these guys are pretty impressive. So I'm not talking about the most recent rover, but I'm talking about the Mars Opportunity rover and its twin rover, Spirit. And these two guys were only supposed to last a few months, but they've been there now for 10 years. And Spirit didn't last quite as long. It did fail after a little while. But the Opportunity rover is still going, and it's still sending back really interesting and important stuff. And in recognition of all the stuff that the rover has found, there has been this compilation of articles about all the data and the analyses that scientists have been able to get out of the little samples and the little tests that the rover has been able to do on board there on Mars. And so one article that is particularly exciting and interesting has reported on the findings of analyses of some of the oldest minerals ever obtained by any of the rovers, probably actually anywhere in the solar system as well, because these things that it was analyzing are about 4 billion years old. And you might remember I talked a couple weeks ago about some samples that were taken in Australia and others that are kind of similar to that were also taken in South Africa. And these things are kind of in this realm of age. So I mean, these are amongst the oldest things we have ever looked at. And so it's quite exciting to have the chance to look at this sort of thing, not just here on Earth, but also across the solar system on a totally different planet. And it's particularly interesting not just because of the age, but also because these things are being analyzed for evidence, not of life specifically, but of conditions that would have been favorable, or at least would have allowed life to occur on Mars. And in fact, these results have found that there probably was liquid water on Mars about 4 billion years ago, which we already kind of knew, or at least suspected. But the really exciting thing here is that that water was fresh. And it was so fresh that it potentially could have supported life as we know it here on Earth. And this follows evidence from satellite images and also rock analyses, and both of these indicated that the planet has likely experienced water activity in the past, which is why I say that we did kind of suspect this. But the water that was detected using these methods would have been extremely acidic, so kind of on the order of vinegar. And as you might imagine, that's not the most happy habitat for little organisms. In fact, probably it would have been very, very difficult for things like bacteria or algae to ever have grown and evolved and come to being in such conditions. And so it's not very conducive to life. But these latest results are from much, much older samples, and they date to a time when the water was much fresher. And it was deposited in the soil, which would have created really muddy environments. And a lot of researchers here on Earth suggest that mud is actually one of the places where life might have emerged. So there are even some theories that the very first things that we could call life are actually really simple clays. And, you know, I'm talking about actually wet mud in this case. So we're not talking about anything that's actually that different from what these guys are looking at here on Mars. So potentially here we have findings that suggest that we aren't the only planet in the solar system that could have supported life. And an additional reason that these results are so exciting was that, as I mentioned, the rover was only supposed to last months, but it has now lasted for a decade. So instead of going only a few hundred meters, it's explored about 38 kilometers of the Martian landscape, and it's sent back data that have to do with geology and chemistry and also spectral data. So we're able to take all those little bits and pieces and put them together and have a much better idea of this environment in which this other life might potentially have been born, or have lived for a while, or if nothing else, another environment in which there is water. And as I mentioned earlier, of course, water is this really fundamental thing, and even if we don't find life on other planets, it's a really exciting thing to find evidence of water, or even water itself, because this could help us kind of understand, just comparatively, why might life begin on Earth and not elsewhere, or did it maybe come into being elsewhere and then die out? Or could we go to those places and utilize some water stores that might be there? Or could we kind of get the system back to where it was when it had water? So there are all sorts of reasons why this sort of evidence, even if it is quite rudimentary, is still really exciting. And it also does help researchers figure out where they can focus if they're going to look on Mars for things like microfossils and contemporary water deposits that we might utilize, and also any other signs of life. So all these little things can work together to help us design better studies in the future. Welcome back to The Wild Side. That was Moon in the Water by Dawes. And on today's show, I'm trying to catch you guys up on some of the most recent science news that you might have missed. And just before the break, I was talking about some really ancient samples that have been analyzed on Mars by one of the Mars rovers. And now I want to keep looking back in the past, although I want to bring it back here to Earth. And the particular finding that I want to talk about next is that scientists have uncovered the genome of the oldest cancer that has ever been found on Earth. And this is not in humans, it's actually in canines. And it is a sexually transmitted disease that results in genital tumors in dogs. And it's the oldest known continually surviving cancer in the world. And it first emerged about 11,000 years ago in only a single dog. And that dog would have mated with another individual and then transferred the genes on, and then so on and so on for 11,000 more years, until now we see this around the world. And the genome is actually fairly massive in that it contains 2 million mutations. So even if it doesn't have tons and tons of genes, it contains a really high proportion of mutations. And that's quite unusual because in typical human cancers, genomes only have 1 to 5,000 mutations. And so this is extremely high. And this is one of the things that researchers were actually able to use to their advantage, because they were able to focus in on one of these mutations and kind of follow it over the years, and in doing so, use that information to age the cancer and determine how old it is and how long it's been around. And this technique is called, well, you're basically using the mutation as a molecular clock, and so you can kind of count backwards from now until the emergence of that mutation and figure out the origin of the entire cancer. So in addition to the mutations, of course those aren't the only things in the genome, it also contains genes from the original cancer host or victim, or whatever you want to call this poor dog. And this allowed researchers to determine, by looking at these characteristics, what sort of dog would originally have been afflicted by this disease, and what sort of population this disease would have emerged in. So what they found by looking at these genes and comparing those to the genes of contemporary dogs is that the original carrier of this would have been something like an Alaskan Malamute or a Husky, so one of those kind of cold weather northern dogs. It would have had something like a gray brownish kind of coat or a black coat, so a very dark colored dog, and it would have had short straight hairs. And of course this doesn't really tell you a whole lot about the emergence of the cancer itself, but it is quite interesting for helping you visualize that very first dog in which this thing emerged, and from which this thing has spread across the world and across all these different dogs. Now unfortunately researchers weren't able to tell whether the original patient was a male or female, which might have been kind of interesting in that it potentially could say something about which sex is more susceptible to getting this sort of disease, and maybe which sex is more susceptible to transferring it on, depending on whether we know those sorts of things about other STDs as well. But one thing they could tell was that it was a relatively inbred individual, and this suggests that it was from quite a small and or isolated population. And as I've mentioned already, the cancer is now quite widespread, which means that we can use this kind of fundamental basic genomic information to understand how the disease has leapt between individuals and between populations to reach the spread that it currently has. And because we know this information, we can also potentially figure out how to combat this particular disease, and maybe other diseases like it. So the dynamics of this suggest that the cancer existed in this isolated population of the origin dog for most of its history, actually, and so only within the last 500 years or so would this thing actually have spread around the globe. And what's kind of cool about that fact is that it coincides with what we call the age of exploration. So this time when we have, in particular, Europeans who are leaving in ships and going around the world, and they probably would have had canine pets that they took with them. Or potentially they went places and picked up dogs while they were there and then brought them back with them to Europe. Or maybe it was some combination of that, and they had dogs and they took them places and those dogs mated and they brought back the offspring. But, whatever the particular scenario is, you can easily see how the increased movement of people around the world would have helped also increase the movement of their companion animals and the genes and diseases carried within those companion animals. So it's pretty likely that it is these explorers who helped move this disease, this cancer, around the world. Now another reason why the study is interesting is that transmissible cancers like this one are actually quite rare. Rare to the point where the only other known example is in Tasmanian devils. And the devils actually are suffering from this quite extensively. It's one of the reasons that they are kind of having trouble in terms of conservation and population stability, because these guys will bite each other's muzzles. And sometimes they do it in an actual fight, but other times they do it when they're just kind of playing around when they're young, when they're pups, and they're kind of practicing how to fight when they're adults. And when they do this, they create these lesions, and it allows the disease to spread. And so they get this cancer, and the cancer can ultimately do quite a lot of harm to individuals and entire populations. So of course, even if Tasmanian devils If this turned out to be the only other organisms in which this happened, this is still quite an interesting thing because we really want to save the devils. And so if we can understand something about this cancer in dogs and relate that to the devils in such a way that we can maybe help manage them a bit better and help their populations, then obviously that would be quite a useful thing. And of course all of that is quite different from the normal spread of cancer, which tends to happen within an individual in a process that you most likely know of as metastasis. And so any kind of information that we can glean about the spread of cancer and the movement of cancer, even if it's between individuals, we might be able to use that also in humans when we're thinking about the spread of cancer from one part of the body to the next. Because really, kind of biologically, there isn't an extremely huge difference in between those things. What we really want to just look at is movement of cancer and reestablishment in a new location. So if we can kind of find parallels between those things, then actually we can learn a lot about this and generalize that information from one type of patient and one type of cancer to another. Or at least that is the hope. Because there's another kind of fear, which is that potentially we might have an emergence of transmissible cancers at some point in humans. And this is by no means necessarily going to be the case, but you never know when these things might emerge. And especially now that we have, kind of global gene spread, it is one of those things that is a possibility because you never know what's going to happen. And so kind of understanding all these different scenarios can be really useful in predicting what might happen and figuring out how we're going to react, how we should react if these things do become a problem. So we might be able to find out about this kind of stuff in order to safeguard against problems in the future and just understand about the evolution of cancer in general, because of course that would be really useful to humans and other animals that are afflicted. Now again, keeping in the theme of kind of disease, but one that's slightly less, I guess, depressing, one that's kind of just maybe a little bit repulsive in a way, but also very interesting. If you're like me anyway, you'll find this interesting, which is the recent finding that humans may be able to identify sick people by smell. And one of the reasons I found this to be quite an intriguing finding is that there also was a recent study that suggested that the quote-unquote old people smell is a real thing because there are certain changes in the way that cells do things and certain changes in the chemicals that they produce that we can detect by smell. Well, it turns out that similarly there may be this ability of humans to identify sick people, again because there are changes in how the body is doing things. And these particular results are actually from a very small study, so I'm not sure that we can necessarily, take them as gospel just yet, but they are still intriguing and kind of fun to think about. So what the Swedish researchers did was take 8 healthy people and give them one of 2 injections. One was a saltwater injection, which would have been a control that should have no effect on anyone, and the other was an injection of lipopolysaccharide. And this is a bacterial toxin that should have elicited a really strong immune response in these people. So the people that got this, the 4 people that got this, should have been quite ill, whereas the other 4 should have been completely normal and gone on doing things as they always do. So 4 hours after the injection, the researchers collected T-shirts from the participants with the idea that while they'd been wearing those T-shirts after they'd been injected, they would have been sweating and producing whatever regular chemicals their skin would produce, and they would kind of collect that in the cotton through the oil, through the sweat, through whatever. And so they then cut out the armpits of these T-shirts because of course that is kind of an area where scents and moisture particularly start to collect. And so they cut those out and stuck them into bottles. And then, and this is the great part, they found 40 volunteer university students. You have to wonder what they offered these poor kids as compensation. And they had all these guys sniff each of the 8 bottles. And they were asked to rate all of the things that they smelled according to the intensity of the smell, the pleasantness, and also whether or not they perceived it to be kind of a healthy scent or an unhealthy scent. And what the results suggest is that people who were injected with the toxin, people who are, theoretically sicker, do smell less pleasant to other people around them. So specifically, shirts from people injected with the toxin were consistently being rated as more unpleasant and also more intense smelling. Now, the people also rated these as smelling more unhealthy, but it could be the case that when you smell something that's kind of unpleasant and intense, you then associate that with unhealthiness, whether or not it actually is unhealthy. So that third category is kind of hard to separate from the other two. But another thing that was interesting is that the researchers did actually look on a molecular level at the participants' actual immune responses. And what they found was that the higher the actual immune response, the greater the unpleasantness rating given from the people who were sniffing. So there does seem to be some real relationship here between this kind of subjective scent testing and the immune response of the individuals. And these patterns are in line with some previous reports where people have taken T-shirts and other things from sick people and looked at people with different types of diseases and kind of ascertained that potentially there are some real relationships between disease and smell. So for example, specific things that have in the past been noted as smelling kind of unpleasant are yellow fever, which people have described as having a scent like a butcher's shop, and also gonorrhea. So in a previous study, the sweat of men with gonorrhea was found to be less pleasant than the sweat with men who were STD-free. So it does seem to be kind of a common pattern, or at least there's mounting evidence that this is a common pattern. And it suggests that humans do elicit one or more cues. They don't elicit them, they produce them. And actually these could be cues or they could be signals. So cues are something that are produced kind of inadvertently, just as a byproduct of what your body is already doing. And signaling is something that you actually produce on purpose. And at this point it's kind of hard to say which one of these is the case, because it could be that over time we actually did evolve to produce these things as signals because it helped our close relatives to avoid us when we were sick and could pass disease on to them. Or it could be completely a cue that we just happen to take advantage of because the bacteria or our cells or whatever are doing something different and we can pick up on that smell. And so you could kind of see an argument either way, although I think the latter is probably a bit simpler of an answer. It probably is more likely to be a cue. But either way, it is quite advantageous to healthy individuals to be able to sniff out the people that might infect them and avoid them. So next time you're sick, or next time someone around you is sick, maybe you can close your eyes and do a little sniff test and see if you can tell a difference between when they're healthy and when they're feeling a bit under the weather. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Bat for Lashes with Bat's Mouth. And the reason I've chosen that song to introduce this portion of the show is that the next piece of science news I want to discuss is one that has made the news over the last week or so about how the love ripples from calling frogs can be used by bats that are looking for signals in order to detect their amphibian prey and kind of home in on them. And the ripples in question, of course love ripples is not the scientific term, but that is what the authors of this paper were referring to these as in the press release. They're created by a species of frog called the Tungara frog. And these guys have been extremely well studied in South America in this system where they are predated by bats. And what's quite interesting about this is that these two animals, and I'll get back to this a bit later, have evolved in kind of an arms race with each other. So each of them kind of does something and produces kind of a new technique to outsmart the other, and then the other retaliates and does the very same. So they're each trying to kind of overcome the methods of the other. And in this case, of course, you've got frogs that are trying not to be eaten, but you've got bats that are trying to eat the frogs. And the reason that the bats are able to locate these frogs, or one of the reasons, is that the frogs are using vocalizations, the males I'm talking about here, and these comprise whines and chucks, so they're quite audible, they're quite noticeable and really unique sounds, and they use them to impress females and attract females to their little piece of the pond, and also keep rival males away, especially because they want the males to stay out of the bit where the females might come for mating. And the croaking behavior has been known to make frogs more susceptible to predation, because obviously the bats can hear that and so cue in on the frogs. But a recent study has provided some more information on exactly how and why it is that happens. So normally when the bats fly overhead, the frogs will stop calling because they see them and they know that there's a predator out there and they don't want to be attacked. And so of course this reduces noise, so they aren't audible anymore, and it also reduces movement, because they become very still and they aren't making all that movement that's required to inflate and deflate the sac when they're calling. And the thing is, the real kicker is that the frogs are still kind of given away by the habitat, because they're sitting in these little pools when they're calling, because that's of course where the females are going to lay the eggs. And the pools, the water in them will keep rippling as the frogs are moving their sacs around as they're inflating and deflating them. So even if they become really still, if they've just been calling, those ripples will still continue to emanate from them until all of that energy has finally been released. And so in those couple of seconds after the frogs have stopped calling and before the ripples kind of complete their movement across the pond, the bats are able to cue in on that using their echolocation ability and home in on the frog. So what we're talking about here is some really impressive behavior on the bats' parts, because they're able to kind of make these split-second decisions using only a very little amount of information to hone in on the frogs and go in for the kill. And in the current study, they found that the frog-eating bats were more likely to attack a target that had both the calls and the ripples radiating from it than one that had only calls and no ripples at all. So this really does provide the evidence needed to kind of determine that the ripples themselves are the thing that are being detected. But this is not the case when there's vegetation around, and it may be the fact that the leaves in the habitat are kind of preventing the propagation of those ripples. And so having a little bit of vegetation there, particularly in the water where it's going to kind of thwart the movement of those waves, can be really helpful to the frog. And it might be kind of interesting in the future to figure out, does that vegetation have any kind of negative effect, so there's kind of a trade-off, or is this something that the frogs are maybe going to start selecting for, so they're going to look out for these habitats where there are more bits of vegetation, which would be a bit healthier and safer for them. And that's maybe a question that the researchers can look at in the future. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, the whole system is a really good example of this arms race that develops between a predator and a prey. And we see it not just in these particular frogs and these particular bats, but in all sorts of species like this around the world. So here you've got the frog finding a way to avoid detection, so it stops calling when the bat appears, but then the predator finds a way to overcome that obstacle using a different cue in this case. And you see these sorts of things just escalating and escalating and escalating, so they're always trying to one-up each other. Another thing that's kind of an interesting wrench that's thrown in to this particular system is that the ripples appear to provide information also to rival frogs. And this, of course, is a whole other thing that can cause changes in this interaction between the predator and the prey, because it adds a whole other bit of variation and complication. And in this case, what the researchers found was that when a call was accompanied by ripples, other male frogs were more likely to respond than when a call was broadcasted all by itself. And when frogs did respond, they responded more energetically to calls that were accompanied by ripples. So, specifically, when produced outside the rival's territory, they called more quickly, and when produced inside the rival's territory, the other frogs were calling less. So all of this potentially suggests that the ripples may indicate to a potential rival that a male is potentially more threatening, and therefore he needs to kind of alter his display in some way. So it would be really interesting to kind of figure out how it is that these two different players in this game, the predator and also the rival, can impact an individual male frog's decision-making process, and also kind of vice versa. How do the individual males impact those other two individuals in the habitat around him, and what are the big complex things that result? So lots of social dynamics that could potentially be followed up on in this system. Welcome back to the Wild Side. That was the White Stripes with Girl You Have No Faith in Medicine. And I've chosen that song because my next recent science news item is all about medicine, and that is the result that researchers in the pharmaceutical industry have finally figured out how it is that birch tree bark works to help wound healing. And I know this doesn't sound like the most scintillating of topics, but actually it is quite interesting, because birch tree bark extracts have been used for hundreds of years by people who are interested in kind of treating wounds, and nobody until now has really understood how it is that the extract is helping on a molecular basis. So it was kind of understood that this thing did actually have an impact and it was quite beneficial, but no one really knew why it was that it was beneficial. But now they've finally been able to isolate the activity of this stuff, and that means that potentially we could take some of these things and use them in medicine and developing more pharmaceuticals. So the extracts have been prepared traditionally from the outer white layer of the tree's bark, and this contains both betulin and betulinic acid, and these things are called pentacyclic triterpenes, which basically means that they are organic compounds that have lots of little carbon rings, and these things are produced by lots and lots of plants, and particularly by conifers, and they're often very strong smelling, so they may have originally acted as protection for the plants against things like parasites and herbivores. So these are the biologically active substances in that barky portion of the tree. That, of course, barky portion is the scientific term, of course, for this section of the plant. So these things have previously been found to be a whole load of things that are really useful. Excuse me. So they've been found to be adaptogenic and immunomodulating, which means that they help the treated organism respond to illnesses and other unexpected stressors in the environment. They're antioxidant and antihypoxic. They're hepatoprotective, which means they help the liver. They're detoxic, which means they remove harmful substances. They're hypolipidemic, which means they improve vessel conditions. They're anti-inflammatory, anti-allergic, anti-mutagenic, and anti-cancer-causing, antiviral, anti-tuberculosis, and also chemoleptic, which means that on top of all these wonderful things that they do for your health, they also improve your mood. So obviously this sounds like quite the wonder drug, and it's the sort of thing that people would want to understand in better detail because it potentially could be used in lots of different ways. So what they found in the current study was that the extracts work in two phases. And during phase 1, this is the phase when, in the wound healing process, the damaged skin cells are releasing substances, kind of colloquially known as messengers, that increase inflammation, attract phagocytes that remove foreign bacteria and dead tissue. So the extracts, betulin in particular, increases the presence of these inflammatory substances, and it does this by tripling the amount of time that the mRNA of these cellular messengers remains stable. So that's the RNA that is telling the molecular mechanism to make more and more and more of these proteins. So it's basically going to the factory and saying, right, let's make lots of this stuff because the body really needs it right now. And in the second phase, this is the part of the kind of healing process when the skin cells are migrating and closing the wound. And what they found for this part of the process was that the extract is activating proteins that are involved in restructuring the actin cytoskeleton. And this is a really important feature in shaping cells. So it's making it possible for keratinocytes, which are the most common cell type in the epidermis, the outer skin layer, to quickly migrate to the wound and then close it. So basically it's helping in both parts of this wound healing process where you're responding to the infection and then trying to cover up the wound that's been made and kind of regenerate and get back to normal. And all of this confirms hundreds of years of folk medicine, and it may be really useful in developing treatments. And it probably also will help you look at birch in a whole new way and realize that it's actually quite an exciting and interesting plant, even if it looks kind of calm and simple just sitting out there in your garden. Now the last news item that I want to mention is actually one that's been sent to me by my father in the U.S., so I should thank him on air. And this is the finding, the first real experimental evidence, I guess, for quite a long time that really convincingly shows that V formations in birds most likely help improve the energy dynamics of these animals. And this has been suspected for a really long time, but people just haven't been able to kind of collect the data that were really necessary for showing this in a real quantifiable sort of way that could be backed up by statistics. And finally we've been able to collect some of this information thanks to 14 northern bald ibises that migrated the 600-mile trek between Austria and Tuscany. And the ibises had hatched at Zoo Vienna in March of 2011, and they were raised as part of a conservation project that was hoping to reintroduce the birds which are critically endangered to their native European range. So they'd been given all sorts of unique names like Amadeus and Archimedes and Balthazar, and people knew them individually and so could, really assign specific information and specific data to individual birds and really track them as they moved around. And the birds had human foster parents that took them on training flights, and then those eventually got longer and longer and longer until the animals were shown the actual migration route that they would need to take from Salzburg to Italy. And as the birds got more and more used to flying with the paragliders that the humans were using, they got better and better at flying in the V formation. And the researchers did actually notice this anecdotally, and then were able to study the effects of that kind of well-rehearsed V formation on the birds themselves. So what they did was they fit the ibises with lightweight sensors. So these things were less than an ounce, but they contained all sorts of various things that allowed the researchers to track flapping, speed, and direction of travel. And what's really amazing is that this is from accelerometers, gyroscopes, magnet sensors, memory cards, batteries, microcontrollers, all sorts of stuff right there embedded in the sensors, and yet they were so extremely lightweight. And the reason why this was they were never able to get these data before was that the technology simply didn't exist. So it really is kind of a modern thing that we can actually collect this sort of information because we needed to wait for the technology to catch up with what scientists wanted to do. So they were able to totally analyze 24,000 separate flaps, 7 full minutes of flight time, and find that the birds were always positioning themselves in an aerodynamically optimal position. So basically, they were always taking advantage of something called tip vortices, and these are a byproduct of winged flight that result from when the wings are pushing down on the air in order to generate lift. And these are basically little swirls of upward moving air that help the birds behind the birds that are producing these vortices. And of course, the one bird that doesn't get any advantage from this is the bird that's in the front. But what they found was that the ibises were really frequently switching around who is where. So everyone was always getting the chance to get some help from the bird in front. And it's not yet clear how much total energy is saved by all of this optimal positioning over, an entire flight. But even little minor amounts per flap or per stage of journey could be really useful over that entire 600 miles that the birds are flying. Also unknown is how the birds know how to fly in that way. Is it something that's ingrained in them? Do they learn it from experience? Is it a combination of the two? No one really knows yet, so it'll be quite interesting to try to follow up and study that. And one other kind of interesting thing about these particular birds is that the migration studied in this specific study occurred back in 2011, and that was the birds' very first migration. And they were expected to stay in Italy for a few years before doing their first kind of return journey back to their natal habitat. So this is actually the spring when the birds might go back from Italy to Austria for the very first time. So I'll try to keep an eye on this and see if I can find any developments, because the scientists are quite interested in seeing whether the birds actually do this return journey, how it goes, and what sorts of flying patterns emerge, and are those different from the ones on the way out. So it would be quite interesting to see how this one compares to that first one that they did. And on that note, I think I will wrap up for this week on another flying-themed song. So I will play Chris Isaak with Flying, and I will talk to you next week.